Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you our Waycrest Manor guide for Dragonflight Season 3 for 10.2. In this, we're going to go over the bosses, as well as some of the priority trash mobs that you want to make sure you're focusing down, some routing advice, and how you want to make sure you're using your lusts. Starting it off, the doors of Waycrest Manor are all open, and so as a result, you can kind of pick and choose where you'd like to go. As you're routing through the dungeon, if you didn't play back in BFA, there's a number of witch spawns, which you'll see by a little rift, and then the witch is going to spawn nearby. So as a tank, if you see these little rifts, if you're going through it for the first time, keep in mind that a witch is going to spawn near that rift, not necessarily on that point, and you don't want it to be beating down one of your DPS. Usually what we do is lust on the very first pull, as we'll grab some of the mobs that are in the sort of foyer or the intro to the room, drag them on over into the left side, bring it into the first witch, and then pop lust and start DPSing them down. The very first boss that you're going to be going up against is the Waycrest Triad. It's going to be featuring 3 different witches with different abilities, and they pass an iris to each other, which allows them to be damaged. During that, all the other witches are taking 99% less damage. It starts with Lady Selena. She has a heal reduction onto all of your allies, and she'll put up a mind control onto one player, and it's almost always a DPS. Using stuns that are magic effects, kind of like Hammer of Justice, are really, really good because then it allows the healer to insta-dispel that player, and you don't have to worry about the mind control player using any big cooldown or ability to DPS your friends. So make sure you have some kind of stun on hand, as it does help out a lot. She will then pass the iris on to Malady, who does ticking damage, and this damage is going to stack and ramp up if you're standing still, so make sure that you're moving around. Then she's going to have her sort of ultimate ability, which is going to put curses on all of your allies. You can dispel this if you have curses on hand, but it's not a massive deal. You're just going to have a bit of extra healing that you have to do. Lady Briar is going to be dealing ticking damage on the party because she has a thorns mechanic, where the more damage you deal to her, the damage then gets dealt back to you. She also has a Jagged Nettles that deals really heavy instant damage, and so being able to have a large external or being able to immune it is insanely nice. It's also leaving a nasty bleed, which you can dwarf, you can cauterize, but it's also a grievous bleed, so if you top it off, it gets removed. This is really important to make sure that you top off before the orb goes back to Selena, because that's when the heal reduction happens and players start slowly kind of getting ticked down from some of the bolts that are going off. You pretty much want to make sure that you're continuously interrupting as best as you can. We're pretty much focused on doing an interrupt rotation on the main target as often as possible, since they are all just kind of firing off bolts onto players. As long as you're alternating with these interrupts frequently, you should be having no problem. Once you down the Waycrest Triad, there's a lot of trash percentage that usually gets acquired by going onto the left side. With this, some of the trash pulls you're going to have to go up against, so the captains are going to be casting Spirited Defense, which is going to be reducing the enemy damage taken. You can also purge it, but it's always nice to make sure that you kick it. There's another mechanic later on in the dungeon before Lady Waycrest, which is called Warding Candles, which also does the same thing, but it's a ground effect instead. There's a number of different casters that will be casting Infected Thorn throughout the instance. Some of them are witches, some of them are initiates. They're all disease dispels, and so you want to make sure that you're interrupting as many of these as possible, especially if you don't have disease dispels. But even if you do, you want to make sure you interrupt these casts as often as you possibly can. And keep in mind that when you're pulling up some of the little Gorger mobs, some of the little ticks, they're going to cast an infect on the tank, which is going to infect them with more Gorgers and more nasty and deal really, really heavy damage to them. So there's a number of different heavy casts in this first area. You also have to deal with the Pallid Gorgers, which are going to leap up onto ranged players. And there's a safe spot which you can stand up onto, which is the fountain in the courtyard, that you can have your ranged stand on so that they're not going to get jumped at. And as long as your melee players are deep in melee and they're not sitting at max range or anything like that, or running out for a mechanic, they should not get jumped on either. While there is really, really heavy damage going out onto the tank, and there can be for the group, keep in mind that the spells that you want to focus on are primarily going to be magic effects and diseases throughout this dungeon. You pretty much, if you have a disease dispel, you'll be dispelling almost on cooldown throughout some of these really large pulls, because it's difficult to get every single cast. The curse effects in this dungeon, like I mentioned with the Waycrest Triad, they're nice to be able to get if you can. Like if you have a Cauterizing Flame as an evoker and you could dispel a curse or a bleed or a disease, you definitely want to make sure you're prioritizing diseases or bleeds first over dispelling any sort of curses. Soulbound Goliath usually is the second boss, and we often try to make sure we have Bloodlust for this fight, as the longer that he stays sort of unburnt, the more damage he's going to start ramping up onto the tank. And what you're able to do is have the boss get kited into one of the fire puddles that spawns nearby. He will then light on fire, releasing spirits. Now, these spirits are also going to aggro based off of healing aggro. Since you can't deal any damage to them, you can't kill them. They'll just sort of time out eventually. As a healer, you need to make sure that you are walking very, very far away from your party whenever the AoE damage from the fire is going to be going out. Because otherwise, you're taking the damage from the boss burning, and then you're getting meleeed by flaming fists from some spirits that you can't knock back, crowd control, kill, or otherwise get rid of. If you are a priest player, you can fade and then not get aggro, but then that diverts aggro to maybe the tank, maybe somebody using like a Nature's Vigil or a Vamp Embrace, so kind of keep that in mind, that fade may not be the best use at that point in time. It's also important to note that the thorns that trap players are only targeting DPS players on PTR. Back in Battle for Azeroth, they used to actually target healers, and so there's like kind of like a fine dance you had to do of like making sure you didn't get targeted by these thorns. But at least on Dragonflight Season 3 PTR, it's not targeting healers, so you can run to max range to be able to heal your allies, kind of kite around those flaming spirits, and be okay. As a tank, usually we were having like 3 rounds of soul thorns and then clearing every single time with the fire. That way it kind of gives everybody time for their defenses to come back, and usually you would wait for a soul's thorns, clear it, and then jump into the fire as well to start clearing some of those stacks. Raal is largely unchanged from BFA. He has his expulsion frontal that is very inconsistent, but basically if you're facing in front of it or near it, it will probably deal a lot of damage to you, spewing out some little oozlings. Tenderize is not a magical effect, even though it kind of looks like one. So a lot of rogues, make sure you know that you cannot cloak it. You can, of course, run around and dodge it. So the waiters from the edges of the room are going to try to come into the boss room, and he's going to try to eat them. If he eats them, then it's going to then he's going to pulse ticking damage onto the entire party. So make sure you're watching out for that. This fight is usually where a lot of people are going to be bringing a lot of trash into the boss, because it is so easy to be able to fight up against this boss and kind of just run all over the place. It's important to keep in mind, though, that some of the waiters that have these dinner bell casts make it significantly harder to be able to bring into the boss, because unlike in BFA, these dinner bell casts cannot be interrupted, and so there's a lot of like area denial that you have if you did pull it into the boss. Before you fight up against Lord and Lady Waycrest, or the trash that is in that room as well, you want to make sure you have around 82 to 83% of enemy forces before you pull any trash in Lord and Lady Waycrest's room. If you are going to be pulling one of the casters that's in the corner, you probably want to have like 84 or 85%. But if you're around that point, you should be good on percentage, and you can skip that basement level of mobs that has some of the caster patrols and has some really nasty mobs, really nasty witches that are all over the place. But if you need extra enemy forces, like I said, around 82 to 84%, depending on if you want to pull everything in Lord and Lady Waycrest's room, is going to be preferable before you finish up the instance. The actual trash in that room has Soul Bolt, Soul Essences, all kinds of casters. You want to make sure that you're saving kicks for volleys in particular, and moving mobs out of those warding candle effects as quickly as you possibly can, and getting any of the other like tertiary like Soul Bolt casts that you're going to be seeing, or Scar Soul casts that you're seeing on the side. There's a lot of casters that are in this part of the area, and there's also constant magic dispels that are happening that are sort of instant cast from these enemies. So make sure you're dispelling as fast as you possibly can. Lord and Lady Waycrest is quite straightforward, but it often can be a pretty high HPS check. Lord Waycrest is spawning first, and he will be dropping these diseased effects onto one of your allies. You can always instant dispel it as long as everybody is spread out constantly, so make sure that they are doing that as best you can. If you do not have a disease dispel in this instance, it is significantly harder, because those dots deal a very hefty amount of damage. If you're a ranged player with an interrupt, you want to make sure that you're as close to that sort of like ditch that is sort of walled off in the room, so that way that you're able to interrupt the racking cord casts by Lady Waycrest. It's about a 38-yard range or something like that between you and the boss, so you should have just enough space to be able to get the occasional interrupt to reduce some of the AoE damage that's taken. Phase 1, with just Lord Waycrest, he will constantly drain health from Lady Waycrest. Once he does that enough times, Lady Waycrest also spawns, and so as long as you're able to continue kicking Lady Waycrest, you can focus down Lord Waycrest, reducing a lot of the tank damage, and then be able to just keep on kicking Lady Waycrest, and you'll be just fine. While we often use Lust for Lord and Lady Waycrest because the fight can be pretty long and really heavy in terms of the damage, Golrock Tool is extraordinarily straightforward and easier to counter. We would often be pulling trash with boss if we had major CDs available. What you want to make sure that you're doing is that there's also adds that look just like the trash that you fought before him that are going to be spawning, and they'll try to channel into your allies, which will stun them. You need to make sure that you're having a knockback or a hard CC to be able to stop these ad spawns that Golrock Tool has. And when he's at max energy, he's going to unleash an AoE and also res all of the ads that you had killed that are spawned from the boss. If you bring trash in, he's not going to respawn the trash, so don't worry there. Keep in mind that the ads he spawns are going to jump to the furthest range target. And so if every player except for one is in melee, you will always jump to that one target. A lot of times with how the ad spawns work, there's moments where an ad is going to jump onto the ranged player while the boss is doing his mass AoE. On BFA, it did heal the ads, and it seemed kind of inconsistent on PTR as to whether it was or not. And so back in BFA, you would first prioritize some of these ads down and burn them with the candles that are spawning around the room. But then when you notice the boss was near full energy, you would avoid killing one of the ads because you know it's going to get healed, wait for the AoE to go off, and then prio target kill those ads afterwards. And so it's kind of a game there that you have to focus on. If you are the player that's going to be baiting any of these ad jumps, make sure you have a really strong defensive for those moments where the AoE is going off. And of course, you can trade off which players are going to be baiting it as well. Hopefully this guide helped you out. And if you're enjoying these YouTube guides, make sure to subscribe and be sure to check out the live stream if you'd like to see some more of our healing content in action. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Let me know if you have any other questions about Season 3 Mythic Plus, and I'll catch y'all next time.